Morning, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing some random stories and facts about some American presidents. Now, we've all heard different things about General and President Washington. One of the ones I remember most when I was a kid was that supposedly the president had wooden teeth. What actually happened in that one was when he was president, one gentleman whose name I'd forgotten had been called to paint a portrait of the president. He was not very fond of the president, and afterwards, after he painted one of the more famous photos of President Washington, someone asked him about it, and he simply said that the president had a wooden smile, which means, it's kind of just a stiff smile, not really a natural smile. So that is where it got phrased that believed that Washington had wooden teeth. He did not have wooden teeth. He did have porcelain teeth, and he had those actually saved somewhere, but that is not actually true. Another thing about President Washington is he did not have any biological children. He married a widow by the name of Martha Custis, and she had children of her own, John and Patsy, and he allowed them to keep their own names, so the name Custis still carried on, even though he was married to their mother. And once again, he did not have biological children, but he wound up adopting their children and their grandchildren as his own. And one of the grandchildren was the name of George Washington Parke Custis. He actually had become the father of a woman named Mary Custis, who would go on to marry someone who the president knew in the old army by the name of Light Horse Harry Lee, married one of his sons by the name of Robert. So one of his adopted granddaughters by the name of Mary Custis wound up marrying Robert E. Lee. So that is how Lee is actually tied to the Washington family, and that's the only way Lee actually was tied to slavery, was the fact that his wife inherited slaves, and they technically worked on Arlington. That's the way technically that Robert E. Lee could have been tied to slavery, even though he had nothing to do with it himself. More things on random things with presidents is Andrew Jackson, who became president, during the early part of the 19th century. Someone actually went so far, one of his enemies went so far as to call him a jackass. He was so amused by this, he decided he was going to have that become the symbol of the Democratic Party. That is why, some people wondered why the symbol of the Democratic Party is a donkey. It's because President Jackson thought it'd be a funny thing to have it be that, based on someone throwing mud at him over it. Another random thing was Theodore Roosevelt. He wasn't actually running for president. He'd done many different things in the New York legislature and in the New York offices. And it came down to it where his enemies wanted to get rid of him, largely because he was a nonconformist. He did things as he thought they should be done, and he wasn't afraid to back down. He didn't just go with the flow. He wasn't afraid to stir the pot when he needed to, and something needed to get done. And so someone had a brilliant idea, because it was an election year with future President McKinley, and they wanted to have him run as his vice president. The idea was anyone who became vice president, that was considered a career ender. Once you were vice president, you were done. You didn't do anything as vice president. You were a nobody, and you just faded into obscurity. That's what they hoped that would happen with Theodore Roosevelt. Unfortunately, in 1901, not very far into McKinley's presidency, McKinley died. Therefore, Theodore Roosevelt was made president of the United States in 1901 and ran, successfully for re-election in 1904. And Theodore Roosevelt was one of the main individuals who have formed American ideology in the early 20th century. And another random fact, now this one's speculative, but I still think it's funny. You had Howard Taft, his handpicked successor to become president afterwards. There are so many different things rumored because he was a big guy. He was upwards of 340 pounds. There are different stories about him supposedly getting stuck in a bathtub. I've heard different things. Some people say it happened random places. I heard it happen in what was called the Hotel Utah, which is now the Joseph Smith Memorial Building in Salt Lake. I've heard that might have happened there, but no one can validate that story. So those are some random things that happened there. Another thing, I was determined to find this one out, but I cannot find the fact on it. They cannot say whether or not for sure where this started. The 7th inning stretch of baseball. Some people say that it was either President Taft or President Wilson or someone else who suddenly stood up around the 7th inning of a baseball game to stretch, because he was stiff sitting in his chair. Someone say it was started by either Taft or Wilson to start the 7th inning stretch. So those are some random presidential thoughts for you. Have a good one.